Today I will present you with the top 10 most brutal experiments conducted on people. Number 10. Dr. Mengele's twin obsession. Dr. Mengele, who came to Auschwitz in 1943, was obsessed with twins. So when twins had the unfortunate fate of arriving at the concentration camp, their treatment seemed preferential at first. However, they would later pay for it in the price of inhumane experiments. Painful bloodshed of cervical sections, the spinal columns removed, or the infections of one twin with a disease to compare the state of the health with a non-infected person. Ultimately, the twins would be euthanized. Mengele also had an obsession with blue eyes. Those who were subject to his research had painful tests, such as toxic injections directly into the victim's eyes, hoping to change the color of the iris. Number 9. The QK Hilltop Project. Launched by the CIA in 1954, the QK Hilltop Project aimed to investigate Chinese brainwashing. It was led by Dr. Harold Wolff from the Cornell University Medical School. His team had developed new methods of questioning with the indirect application of medicines and brain destruction techniques. The CIA, at the request of the chief investigator, provided information on the detention of suspects, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, sleep deprivation, and other inhumane control measures, all tested on prisoners. Wolff developed an action plan in hope that the CIA would provide him with people he could experiment on to confirm the effectiveness of his plan. Number 8. False memories. The best-known case of false memory induction happened in the state of Wisconsin in the year of 1986. This highly unethical method, carried out under the guidance of therapy by American psychologists and psychiatrists, was based on hypnotism and a method of persuasion to make the subject believe that they had underwent cruel experiments, sexual abuse, violence, and unimaginable trauma. One subject, Nadine Kuhl, was reported to a psychologist because her daughter's trauma. In the end, she was subject to the implementation of false memories. One victim recalls being subjected to the implementation of false memories, which made her believe that she was raped as a member of a satanic cult, and that she saw the murder of a childhood friend. Eventually, the woman managed to regain good health and received compensation for her hardships. But sadly, she's not the only one out there, and most never saw justice. Number 7. Statevilles Malaria Survey. During World War II, one of the greatest challenges for American troops in the Pacific was tropical disease. In order to improve the situation, it was decided to initiate a malaria research project. The study was carried out at the Stateville Penitentiary in Joliet, Illinois. Doctors from the University of Chicago infected 441 people with the illness, one of which died from complications. But researchers denied any connection between the death and their experiment, which was praised widely in some circles. During this 29-year-long experiment, vital elements discovered are still being used to treat malaria to this very day. Number 6. LSD and electric shock treatment. For many years, Dr. Loretta Bender had been considered an outstanding psychiatrist, specializing in the fields of autism and schizophrenia. But something she did in the past would bring wild criticism today. More specifically, I'm referring to her LSD quote-unquote method, where huge doses of LSD and electric shock were used against children. One tragic story involves a boy who was taken by the state from his biological mother who was mentally ill. At the time, Dr. Bender lacked subjects for her research, so after she diagnosed the child as having schizophrenia, her cruelest experiment of all began. The following quote is directly from the boy, who recalls the methods used against him in 1944. I received 20 doses of electric shock. I cried. I was pulled into a corridor forcibly. My lips were clogged with a napkin so I couldn't bite off my tongue. These cruelties caused permanent trauma in the child, resulting in him spending 10 years of his life in institutions. Dr. Bender has never been held responsible for her actions. Number 5. Emma Eckstein, Sigmund Freud, and Wilhelm Fliess. Emma Eckstein was the first patient of Sigmund Freud to be analyzed. She visited at the age of 27 with abdominal pains and menstrual problems. Freud believed that the woman had suffered hysteria and that the cause of her problems was excessive masturbation. Remember, in 1984, masturbation was considered to be a serious threat to mental health. At the time, Freud was influenced by a laryngologist named Wilhelm Fleiss, who believed that the source of sexual illnesses came from one's nose. In any event, Fleiss believed that a nasal operation would eliminate the woman's problem, so he undertook the procedure, even though he didn't have much experience in this type of work. Needless to say, the results were disastrous, ending up with the patient having a permanently deformed face. Number 4. Hepatitis in quote-unquote handicapped children. In the 1950s, at Willowbrook State School, New York, some appalling research on the spread of hepatitis began with experimenting on children with mental disabilities. The institution was in shambles, which meant that a following epidemic was practically guaranteed. Hence, Dr. Sal Krugman, who worked on the vaccine, said it would be a good idea to carry out an experiment there. The whole idea was controversial from the beginning, but in the end, parental consent was obtained for carrying out the trial. It should be mentioned now that at the time, the institutions were severely overcrowded, so agreeing to participate in experimental medicine was one way to ensure that a child would have a place in an institution if need be. Sadly, the outcome was probably not what the parents had hoped for. Number 3. Mustard gas. In 1942, the U.S. set out to test the strength of mustard gas. Officially, the United States Navy wanted to see how it could be handled by gas masks and clothing. An experiment at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington was carried out with 17 participants in their late teens, who believed that their participation would help shorten the war. However, the equipment was probably poorly prepared, because everyone involved suffered extreme internal and external burns. And although the Navy didn't face any liability for their actions at the time, 48 years later in 1991, the matter was brought before Congress. Number 2. The Soviet Chamber. The Soviet Union had a so-called chamber, as well as labs number 1 and 12, which were all top-secret facilities, where a number of deadly poisons were tested on gulag prisoners. The purpose of this inhumane research was to create a lethal chemical compound that would have no taste, no secretion, and no smell. Its only detection would be the death of the victim. Among the substances tested, there was mustard gas, digitoxin, ricin, and many others. Victims of the experiment were given their quote-unquote medicine in the form of food or drink. Dr. Marinovsky, who coordinated activities at the chamber, used people of different genders, age, and health conditions, both physically and mentally. The substance finally developed was named C2. One witness recalls the victims were physically battered, weakened quickly, calmed down, and then they were dead within 15 minutes. Number 1. Experiments in North Korea. Unfortunately, this is not an example from the distant past. Human rights organizations have been alarmed for years at the scale of inhumane experience conducted in North Korea. The government there denies everything, but you can find horrifying stories from refugees online. One woman said that she witnessed 50 healthy women being forced to eat poisoned cabbage leaves, and that they knew they were being poisoned. After 20 minutes, each and every one of them began vomiting blood and hemorrhaging from their behind. Then, they passed away. The government has refused to pay any compensation to families, and the worst part is the seeming lack of reason for this so-called experiment. That's it for today's episode of Exit 10. Hit the subscribe button, leave me a comment, and I will see you next week.